is Liz Tyson. She worked as the director of the UK charity the Captive Animals Protection Society since 2010. She seeks an end to the exploitation of animals for entertainment purpose and has a strong focus on zoos, on circuses and on exotic pet trade. Today she will talk on how existing laws can be exploited by campaigns to reach abolitionist goals.
Let's see. Try and do this. Does that work? Yeah, good. Great, so thank you so much to everyone that's come to listen to this presentation. For those of you that were here yesterday, I'm hoping, having listened to some of the discussion yesterday, it will add some interesting sort of additions, particularly to the discussions going on between prohibitive reform and abolition. So what I want to talk to you about is really how the law can be incorporated into campaigns in sort of a very integrated way. Let me start from the beginning. So my name is Liz Tyson. As already been said, I'm director of the UK charity Captive Animals Protection Society. We're an abolitionist organisation that works surrounding animals in captivity with a major focus on zoos and circuses. In my other life, I'm an academic researcher, I'm a legal researcher, and my work considers whether animals are meaningfully protected by animal welfare laws, mainly in the UK. So, as an animal rights activist, I believe, as I'm sure many, if not all of you here today do, that animal welfare laws, both in the UK and internationally, are fundamentally flawed. We talk of legislation that incorporates the 5 freedoms, and yet the laws themselves, for example, the UK's overarching Animal Welfare Act, which is considered progressive, it's used as an example around the world for other countries to follow. It fails to protect animals from human exploitation in practice. And that is in part because the 5 freedoms, so freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury or disease, freedom to express normal behaviour, and freedom from fear and distress are not really freedoms at all when they're balanced against the requirements of the industries that continue to use the animals for financial gain. So, as you know too well, a law which refers to the 5 freedoms in relation to farmed animals, for example, creates an oxymoron. A farmed animal is not free and will never be free. To give you just a couple of examples to demonstrate how these laws fail the animals, again using the Animal Welfare Act as an example, this Act purports to protect all vertebrate animals under the control of man from unnecessary suffering. Despite this, exemptions under exactly the same legislation allow the debeaking of chickens, so quite literally slicing off part of an animal's face. The Act concedes that anything done to animals under the ASPA regulations, so the Animals in Scientific Procedures Act, is exempted, so of course hideous suffering can be caused during licensed experiments. The Act exempts anything at all done during the normal course of fishing. So I could go on. It's clear that whilst arguably some animal protection legislation is better than none, it can't be argued that animals are meaningfully protected by the UK's overarching animal welfare legislation. And this is just one law of many across the world which follow the same sort of pattern. So, on a fundamental level, I reject the claim that animals are generally and meaningfully protected by law, either in the UK or around the world. I believe, as again I'm sure many of you do, that true protection of animals under the law will be a long time coming. It will require a fundamental paradigm shift towards a rights-based approach in law, the abolition of the idea of animals as property, of course, rather than the current anthropocentric approach, which only allows welfare needs to be met to the extent that they don't interfere with the industries using these animals. And I believe the view shared by many other activists working in the movement. So, for example, when the UK government sought to introduce measures to license the use of animals in circuses, they claimed they were going to introduce high welfare standards. My organisation, along with everybody else working on this issue, categorically rejected the proposals. We didn't work with government to create high standards of welfare by virtue of regulation because we don't believe that there are any standards of welfare which would provide an animal in a circus with a life worth living. Prohibition is the only solution, in our view, that would guarantee the animal's intrinsic right not to be utilised for human use is recognised. So in short, and to steal the well-coined phrase, we're working for circuses without cages rather than circuses for bigger cages. So it leads to the question, can abolitionists ever use the law to further their aims? Now, for me, this breaks down into two questions. I think, first of all, can abolitionists be involved in developing laws, so such as these welfare standards for circuses, to raise welfare standards in animal use industries? I think if you're truly abolitionist, for me, the answer is no. However, another question, can abolitionists use existing laws which already exist, which regulate animal use in industries to further the cause for abolition? And I believe the answer to this is yes. So, as a law graduate and a doctoral researcher, I recognise that whilst we work towards this paradigm shift that we all want, which recognises rights over and above making incremental welfare improvements which do nothing to fundamentally challenge the continuance of animal exploitation, I do believe there's work that can be done using laws that are currently in place, however inadequate they are on the whole, to further the cause for abolition. One of the reasons for that is that there are currently in the UK alone over 3,500 mentions of the term animal welfare on the UK statute book. So somewhere along the line, someone has been considering animals and they've recognised that there's something that needs to be protected there. I believe that by examining these laws, finding their failures on a micro level rather than a macro level, then we can reach tangible changes for the animals. And the final thing to point out before I move on is to give you some examples and case studies of how we've used the law in practice, is to say it's often thought that prosecutions, litigation is the only way that the law can be used in campaigning. It's not that. It's quite rare to see campaigns integrating it at earlier stages. Whilst prosecuting can, of course, be a very, very effective way to bring offenders to justice and raise awareness of a campaign, it is, of course, very expensive. And therefore, it falls outside of the realms of reality for many small groups. What I want to talk to you about today, though, is prosecutions will be one of them, but there are a whole host of options which we can use by using legislation in order to further the cause at very little cost to small groups. So, what can be achieved on a sort of generalised level by using the law as part of our campaigns? First of all, knowing how to use the law as a means to access information from public bodies can give you vital evidence for your campaigning. Some of you, I'm sure, will already use this, but freedom of information laws, which exist across countries, give citizens the right to access to information held by public bodies. They differ from country to country, and if you don't use freedom of information in your campaigning at the moment, then if you take nothing else away from this talk, please find out about it in your country and start to use it, because it's an incredibly valuable tool. Secondly, by exposing illegal practice within an industry, the credibility and reputation of that industry is brought into question. This can have an effect at both public, obviously from an awareness-raising point of view, and also a governmental level. So, for example, in my experience, a zoo exposed having broken the law will lose visitors, so it will be impacted economically, it will be impacted in terms of its reputation, and it will be brought under much closer scrutiny by the authorities. In terms of media, in terms of just publicising your campaign, major news outlets are often unwilling or simply unable, depending on their charter, to cover just pure ethical issues unless it's within their remit. So major news outlets will often look for either a very balanced view, so one against the other, or they will need to see evidence of illegal practice. If you're talking about an unethical practice which is entirely legal, a lot of the time you won't get the media interested. If a law isn't being enforced against businesses which fail to meet standards, working to see enforcement, even of a law that relates to an industry that you may disagree with fundamentally in principle, can lead to a reduction in the size of the industry in question. So, for example, you may be able to have animals ceased from a circus. You may be able to force authorities to close down a zoo. And finally, and perhaps most importantly in terms of long-term goals, showing that existing welfareist legislation persistently fails to protect animals offers these strong arguments that we need in support of abolitionist measures in the future. So I'll move on now to give you some examples of how we've used this in our own work. So freedom of information, I'll keep coming back to this because for me it's sort of the holy grail of how to use the law in your work. Many of you, as I say, will probably already be aware of freedom of information and already use it in your campaigns. For those of you that haven't heard of it, it's certainly worth looking into. Many, many countries, though not all of them, operate some sort of system whereby citizens are entitled to information held by public bodies if it's deemed to be in the public interest. So in the United Kingdom, this includes access to central and local government, the police force, some educational establishments, including universities, and a host of other institutions. As a citizen, you're entitled to be given access to information deemed in the public interest, although there are always some exemptions, although usually those exemptions can also be challenged. Interestingly, the freedom of information isn't just applicable to official documents produced by the public body itself, but also to relevant information which is held by them. So this might include correspondence with third parties, information submitted to the public body by others. We've used freedom of information requests to access official inspection reports for zoos, correspondence between government and circus industry workers, to see copies of licenses from quasi-government organisations, so arm's-length organisations, licenses issued to zoos to shoot local wildlife, and even internal correspondence between government departments. It's an absolute goldmine of information. The information for us has led to some really, really important steps forward in our campaigns. Media exposés, it's opened new and vital avenues to explore in our work. As I say, if you take nothing else away from this talk, if you don't already use freedom of information in your campaigns, have a look at the regulations in your country and see what you can do with them. So now, to move on to a more specific way in which we've used a very specific piece of legislation in our campaign work, and quite an interesting one for us because we are an anti-zoo organisation, we campaign against zoos, and we carried out a large piece of work in 2011, which was to do this, to challenge the myth that animals in zoos are protected by the law. Now, whilst we're thoroughly opposed to the zoo industry, one of the major obstacles we've met in our campaigning work, and certainly in terms of public awareness raising, is that the zoo industry, when faced with criticism, would boldly inform us that our belief animals suffered in captivity could not possibly be true because they were licensed under the very strict laws which guarantee the absolute highest standards of welfare. This was used as a shield to defend themselves from almost any criticism. We do an investigation, they'd hold up their license and tell us that it couldn't possibly be true because they'd been issued with it, and the government inspector said they were fine. So whilst we don't believe that any license could ever provide animals a life worth living in a zoo, the argument was a strong one in the eyes of the public. They believed that if a zoo was inspected by government-appointed vets and given the all-clear, then it must be okay. In the same way that zoos claim they contribute to conservation and we provide evidence to counter that claim, we felt it was really important to address this myth in that animals in zoos were protected by law too. So we set about proving that the animals were not protected by these very strict regulations. In terms of the size of the industry we're looking at, in the UK alone, we've got 465 zoos. In England alone, probably about 200,000 animals. And those are the points I've just been through. So members of the public believe the claims. When campaigns highlight cruelty, neglect or suffering, the industry claims they're bad zoos and they're exceptions to the rule. And animal welfare laws continually used as a shield to defend their actions. So we carried out extensive research into the zoo industry using my favourite thing, freedom of information legislation. We obtained official reports completed by the government inspectors during their inspections. These reports drew conclusions as to whether or not the zoos were compliant with the law. We then used freedom of information to establish whether or not enforcement action had been taken against those zoos that had been recognised as breaking the law. And this is what we found. 380 inspections were missed altogether between 2006 and 2011. 74% of inspections recurring unsatisfactory issues. 90% of inspection reports showed apparent non-compliance with EC legislation. Over 1,000 instances of very clear breaches of the law. None of the instances of breaches of the law were met with any enforcement action whatsoever. And despite the claims that zoos are inspected regularly, animals in practice are afforded 36 seconds of an inspector's time once every 3 years. So what did this mean, though? What did these findings actually mean? First of all, the shocking thing was that these were all just sat in government documents. All of these breaches had been recognised by an inspector, but nobody anywhere had done anything about them. So what had we found out? We'd found that animals are not protected by zoo licensing legislation, but now we had the evidence to prove it. It wasn't just our word against theirs. This, in turn, forced central government to take action. Following the release of our work, central government issued guidance to the enforcement authorities, which in the UK, the local authorities, informing them of their obligations. Up until that point, and without our intervention, local authorities had simply ignored their obligations altogether under the Act, and they were failing to close down zoos that should have been closed. So there are a number of zoos which are open today, which should have been closed years ago for their failure to meet standards. Now that the new guidance has been issued, this was in November last year, so it will take 12 to 24 months for these enforcement orders to start coming through. Local authorities now have absolutely no choice. They must follow their obligations. So when zoos fail to meet standards, actions must be taken against them. It's our prediction that this alone will lead to zoo closures in the coming years. So what effect did this have overall? Not just obviously showing the illegality of it, but bad publicity. It was a huge dent in public confidence. And we've got the zoos, we can list the zoos, so any ongoing campaigns, then we know exactly who's broken the law, we know exactly who's done it, and every piece of campaigning material that goes out there, this is being talked about. We now have concrete evidence to counter claims by zoos that they're meeting legal standards. So it's another way, the same way that we can counter the conservation claims, we've now got a concrete argument to come up against them when they use this as a defence. Central government welcomed the report, which was a real blow to the zoo industry because they had tried to dismiss it as a biased report by an animal rights organisation. Central government then, as I say, took action to ensure that enforcement authorities were fulfilling their obligations. We expect to see zoo closures as enforcement actions carried out. And the EC is currently investigating our claims, and it's taken about 18 months so far, and we've got absolutely nowhere, but they've promised me a response by October. But they're investigating the formal breaches of the EC legislation, which then could lead to consequences for the UK government more generally. In addition to our research, there's also other organisations that have used this sort of tactic. I know I can't see them right now, but the team from Animal Equality have used similar tactics in Spain, where they identified breach of the EC Zoos Directive. They pressed charges against the zoo. It had an economic impact on the zoo itself and was also fantastic media coverage, again, just to show the public that it's not all it's cracked up to be. And when the zoos say that they're following certain things, then if you challenge them, then you can find out that that isn't necessarily the case. So in taking this approach, we were able to combat one of the strongest defences used by the zoo industry. We did no lobbying to change existing legislation, but simply used the law that had been in place for the past 30 years, but that in England, at least, very few people had looked at in detail. To move on to the next case study, this is our newest campaign, challenging the mutilation of birds in UK zoos. Now, there's probably more to say about this afterwards, and this is where the sort of prohibitive reform interest will come in. It doesn't form part of this talk, but I'd be happy to answer any questions on this afterwards, on this particular campaign. So what are we working on here? So pinioning is the partial amputation of the end of a bird's wing at a few days old. It allows zoos to hold animals captive in large open-top enclosures, which gives the impression that the birds could fly away. It makes visitors feel great about themselves because they think they're in nature reserves where the animals aren't held captive. The legal status of pinioning differs across Europe, but in England, for example, it's legal in zoos. It's not legal for agricultural purposes. In terms of the legal status in the UK, it's classed as a mutilation under the law. It's legal in England if it's carried out by a vet. Legal status, as I say, varies around the world. And in England, we know that there are now at least 6,000 birds pinioned in just 5 zoos. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the zoo industry aren't particularly open to talking to me and my organisation, so we're still struggling to find out the true extent of it because they don't want people to know that this is happening. But from evidence that we're gathering, it's likely that the number of birds that have had this done to them will run into tens of thousands. We carried out detailed research into the practice and we published the results. People were really shocked that this barbaric practice was happening, but our plan obviously wasn't simply to raise awareness, but it was to get the practice abolished completely. The reasoning behind this is because whilst stopping pinioning in itself wouldn't stop birds being held in zoos, because in theory zoos could put these birds in large aviaries. However, our knowledge of the zoo industry and the fact that we know that building those aviaries would be cost prohibitive for most members of the zoo industry, and they've told us this, then we know that by banning pinioning, then the likelihood is we will see those species of birds removed from zoos altogether. So very similar to the way that there are no cetaceans held in UK zoos anymore. There's never been a ban, and a lot of people think that there has been a ban. It's actually that the standards back in the 80s were set so high that nobody could actually meet them. And that's basically what we aim to achieve with this campaign. I'm sure there might be questions on this afterwards, which are very welcome. So when we started this campaign, central government initially refused to speak to us at all. basically because it was a legal practice. It had been sanctioned by the Animal Welfare Bill just 6 years ago, and they basically said we're not interested in looking at it again. The national press were uninterested as no laws were being broken, and as part of our research, we went through the legislation which sanctioned pinioning with a fine-tooth comb. This was after the launch. However, it was clear from just one reading of the legislation that pinioning had to be carried out by a vet. Now, our knowledge of the zoo industry, this really struck a chord with us because we knew that the majority of UK zoos don't have in-house vets, and that some zoos were pinioning hundreds of birds a year. Some of the wildlife parks were over 1,000 birds each year. So it begged the question, who was doing this? It seemed highly unlikely to us that these zoos were paying for a vet every single time a bird hatched. So we cross-referenced the law with the guidance issued by the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which is the trade industry body which represents zoos in the UK, and as you can probably imagine, are not our closest friends. The guidance stated that a vet was only required if a bird was more than 10 days old, but this was completely false. This added to our suspicion that the zoo industry was allowing non-vets to carry out this practice. It seemed clear that the zoo industry had either misunderstood or were deliberately ignoring the legislation. So finally, and before we made any mention of our concerns in the public domain, we contacted a number of zoos to innocently ask them who carried out pinioning at their facilities. Only one chain of zoos responded directly to us and confirmed that it was carried out by their staff. It seemed that the zoo industry weren't deliberately breaking the law, but they were completely ignorant of it. This was all the evidence from a campaign's perspective that we needed. We could prove that thousands of birds had been illegally mutilated, and this gave us a whole host of opportunities to move the campaign forward. So in terms of the effect that it had, before the illegality was exposed, as I say, the government had no interest in talking to us about it. The national press couldn't or wouldn't cover the story. The zoo industry dismissed our concerns, as they always do, and zoos were not paying vets fees to pinion birds. After the illegality was exposed, the story was covered in the national press. The piece highlighted the fact that it was being carried out illegally, but the majority of the article was about the practice itself. And that national paper ran a poll asking if the cruel practice should be abolished. 98% of people said yes. The same journalist had attempted to interest his editor in this story on pinioning without the illegal angle, and it was simply rejected. So the news article would never have been published. We would never have got the coverage that we had before had we not found this out. As I say, prior to the illegal practice, government officials were reluctant to speak to us, to say the least. Their hand was forced when the illegality angle was exposed because they needed to be seen to be doing something. They couldn't simply ignore it. In effect, they were forced to speak to us to discuss our concerns. This in turn led to government being forced to accept that action must be taken. They've suggested that they may open up a public consultation on pinioning, which may give us the opportunity to move towards getting the practice banned, which is obviously the ultimate aim of this whole campaign. Like the zoo report, we've been able to categorically state that the zoo industry has been breaking the law, and to be honest, this has been one of the most powerful things of this campaign. They haven't been able to come back to us, and they've had to sit by and watch us publish story after story after story about zoo after zoo after zoo that has been carrying this out illegally. We've recently had articles accepted for peer review, so we'll also have peer-reviewed articles which will then be cited into the future on this issue. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we've heard from a very reliable source in recent weeks that there's an awful lot of unrest in the zoo community around this issue now. Because now it's become clear that pinioning needs to be carried out by a vet. As we suspected, zoos don't want to pay vets to do this. Now, obviously, we're not campaigning to get this done legally, but it's been suggested to us that the expense may force zoos to stop pinioning birds even without any change in the legislation. So simply by analysing the law, looking at what it contained, publicising it, we may succeed in seeing species of birds that are currently being pinioned completely removed from UK zoos. One thing's for sure, we'll see a reduction in pinioning going forward, and we've already seen commitment from a number of zoos just because of the bad publicity that they're going to stop doing this, and they've said, that some of these species will no longer be kept. So prior to the exposure of the legal practice, the campaign was very strong, but we lacked that sort of impetus and we lacked the widespread coverage. We would have had to work for a long time to gain the sort of exposure that we now have. It was by virtue of the fact we could prove it was being done illegally that we made the industry, the government, and the general public sit up and listen. And not just this, but we've now expanded the campaign to Europe with partners following the same route. So there's already strong suggestions that we found the same process being carried out illegally across other European countries, which adds weight to the overall call to get this banned. Before I go on to some slightly more expensive options, the final thing to say is that we will win this campaign. We are really, really confident about this. The steps forward, it's only been running for about 6 months, and the feedback we're getting is we think certainly, within the next few years, we're going to see fantastic results with this. So it should be noted that neither of the case studies I've talked to you about were carried out by barristers or solicitors. We didn't pay a legal team to do this. We carried out our own legal assessment in-house. And to be honest, a thorough read through of the legislation can often throw up some really blindingly obvious breaches if you really know the industry that you're dealing with. The problem is there are very few people scrutinising this legislation from our side. They do the bare minimum from their side. They hold up their certificates to say that they're meeting things, and we need more people to be looking at it from this side critically. So, more expensive options are worth mentioning. We've got, again, there's equivalents in other countries. In the UK, there's judicial review. Judicial review is a way in which to challenge decisions in court. So decisions made by public bodies which were either based on false information, illegal in themselves, or various other criteria can actually be challenged in the courts. And this can lead to really important outcomes for animals. Perhaps the most important one in the UK was that the Welsh badger cull was stopped completely, dead in its tracks, because it was proved, it was taken to judicial review, and it was proved that it was illegal by existing laws. There were no new laws introduced. It was already illegal, but somebody just needed to challenge them on it. If nobody had challenged them, then the cull would have gone ahead. We also, as a tiny organisation, along with another partner organisation, we threatened the UK government with judicial review over their continued refusal to implement a ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. Just the threat of this added significant weight to the ongoing campaign, and within a few months of our intentions that we would be seeing them in court if they didn't act, we had the promise that the ban would be introduced. Prosecutions can be used as a campaigning tool to great effect. Love them or loathe them. The RSPCA prosecution of the Haythrop hunt in the UK last year pushed fox hunting back into the public domain in quite an astounding way. People were coming at it from all angles, but the debate roared on for months and months and months. And all of the smaller campaign groups got great airtime for their issues. Obviously, this type of action can run to an awful lot of money, and this, as an example, was an astounding amount of money, thousands, tens of thousands of pounds. However, there are ways in which these kind of bigger, kind of more litigation-based actions can be carried out dependent on your country's legal system. Our organisation, which is tiny and runs on a very limited budget, would have completely dismissed the idea of threatening the UK government with legal action because we just assumed it would be too expensive for us. A friendly barrister talked us through all of the ways that we could do it, and actually we found that it was perfectly possible. The Badger Trust in the UK, which is currently which challenged the Welsh cull, and is currently one of the groups working to stop or slow down the cull in the UK at the moment. They were a tiny group, and they started off with this same proposal. So just to say, it's worth looking into before you dismiss it out of hand, even if you're a very, very small organisation. In conclusion, you don't need to be or be able to afford to pay a top barrister in order to use the law as an important and effective campaigning tool for animals, and to use it as an integrated part of your normal campaigning. Nor, in my opinion, do you need to be in agreement with the principle behind the legislation, so an anti-zoo organisation using zoo legislation in order to attack the industry. There's always the danger, of course, that by using existing laws in your campaigning, you could be accused of legitimising or implicitly supporting the industry to which you're opposed. It might be that you might be considered as believing that as long as the law is enforced properly, you're okay with it. But I don't accept this argument, because I think you can manage your messaging very clearly, as we all do as campaigners on a day-to-day basis. As long as your objective is clear and your messaging continues to talk of abolition, and you're very, very clear about why you're doing what you're doing, then I don't think there's much danger that you'll fall into that trap. So, to close, just to make the final sort of recommendations, first and foremost, keep going on about it. Familiarise yourself with freedom of information in your country. It has the potential to provide an absolute goldmine of information for your ongoing campaigns. Whatever your main issue, farming, captivity, vivisection, hunting, find out which key pieces of legislation affect your work. Read them thoroughly and make the effort to really understand them. Start to think critically about the industry and how they comply or don't comply with the legislation. Carry out research and see what you can uncover. I can honestly say every time we've looked at something like this, we've found something. We found a stick to beat them with every single time. Don't dismiss wider legal, sort of bigger legal action out of hand. Many small groups have found ways to hold animal exploitation industries to account over their actions in this way. And finally, to close, I really believe that legislation can be used to great effect against animal exploitation, and it remains a resource which is often untapped by abolitionist campaigners. Whilst we work towards legal protection of animals which truly protects them from suffering and exploitation, I hope that we can begin to take existing law into our own hands and use it as a weapon against the industries which have so long used it as a shield to justify their actions. Thank you.
Who has a question? Are there questions?
One specific case we all know about, those little chickens who are killed the first day. I've heard it is illegal in Germany because, or it would be if they are not used in any other way. You know, if they are fed to someone, then it's okay, it's legal. But if they are not, if they are thrown away, then it would be illegal. The problem is, as I have heard, that we now have to discover where it happens that they are just thrown away. Do you have an idea where to go on with this?
I'm not sure I understand, sorry.
I think I understood the question. It's about chickens that hatch and then are thrown away because they are not used for the egg industry.
Right.
And when I understood you right, the German legislation says that there has to be, that you can kill animals if there's a necessity. And this would be legal if the little corpse of the chickens would be used afterwards. So you have to prove that they are not used to make this illegal action.
Oh, I see. I'm afraid I don't know. I don't know what I can add to that really. But what are you asking? I understand what you're saying, but what's the question? Sorry.
I just thought maybe you have an idea what exactly you can do to find out they are doing it the illegal way.
Sorry, I see. It depends, I suppose, from either obviously sort of an investigation going in there and seeing if you can actually get evidence of it, and then failing that, whether or not they need to produce some sort of documentation to show how they dispose of. I don't want to call it waste, but I imagine in their eyes it's waste, whether there's any records that they need to keep or send to any authorities with regard to how they dispose of things. But I'm not really sure, I'm afraid. We haven't dealt with something like that. That's not very helpful, sorry.
Well, I think we have to keep thinking about it because it's such a big thing. If we could end that, would be a great step.
Liz, you mentioned that thanks to the judicial review, in Wales, the badger cull has been stopped.
Yeah.
How can we use this particular judicial review in England, like the legal advice or whatever?
They already tried, unfortunately, and it's a different jurisdiction. The animal welfare and sort of wildlife is dealt with by the Welsh Parliament in Wales and by the English Parliament, of the UK Parliament in England. And the problem is it's a very slightly different law. And so what they found was that it was a slight wording in the law which essentially said that you couldn't you couldn't cull unless there was an absolute guarantee that it would eradicate something. But unfortunately, the equivalent legislation in England has different wording, and they've already tried it, unfortunately. So as far as I know, judicial review has kind of come to an end in England on that issue, unfortunately.
Okay.
But obviously, it was very successful in Wales.
Okay, thank you.
More questions?
Hello, Liz. Thank you for presentation. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask what will happen to the birds which were already mutilated and they won't be longer kept in zoos.
I think from our point of view, it's always a really difficult one because it applies to our entire campaign on zoos. Our sort of pragmatic approach is that we call on zoos to stop breeding and to offer a home for life. So we would expect, realistically, those birds to stay in zoos, but to see a commitment that zoos would no longer pinion, which means that there was, obviously some of these birds can live for 40 years, but if we see an end to pinioning, we won't see new birds born into it. The likelihood is, sadly, is that these birds will probably remain in zoos that have already been pinioned, and we're working for the future generations, I'm afraid. And what, sorry?
What will happen with the animals? That
it really depends. I think it depends on the size of the zoo. We've got zoos ranging from, in the UK, we've got London Zoo, which has got 18,000 animals, which isn't going to close down anytime soon. And then we've got smaller zoos which have, sort of 50, 100 animals. We have, for example, as a result of one of our investigations, we closed down it was sort of a small petting farm with some exotic animals, and all of those animals were rehomed to rescue centres, and the domesticated animals, the rabbits and the other little guys, went to people's homes. So it depends on the zoo itself. Again, realistically, it could be that some of the animals are moved to other zoos. I suppose it's the same way as when you sort of work to close down a lab, and unfortunately that springs up elsewhere. But it's this idea that if we can diminish the number of zoos overall, and then sort of going forward, then we're going to see less and less animals. But it's a very long-term goal.
Hi Liz, sorry
Hi,
I didn't get in at the start of your speech. Are CAPs doing anything about captive animals abroad or just in the UK?
We do some work in Ireland. So we've got the circus campaign in Ireland that we've worked on with Irish activists for a number of years. As a small team, we would absolutely love to work in Europe. When we do, we tend to work with partner organisations, partly from a resource-based point of view, but also from the point of view that we think those activists and those organisations in those countries are much better placed to carry out the work and understand the dynamic and all of that. So where we can offer support overseas, we do, but we don't run our own projects overseas other than in Ireland.
Thank you. And just quickly, I know the UK government were on track to ban wild animals in circuses from 2015, December 2015. And there are only 2 wild animal circuses in the UK. What's the current situation regarding that after the select committee? You've seen the
I met with one of the MPs that was on the select committee on Tuesday, and the last we heard, in his words, that nobody really pays attention to the select committee, so he doesn't think that the government will pay much attention to it, which was nice to hear. Ironically, the MP I met with was on the select committee. But he was also the chair of the all-parliamentary group for animal welfare, and he's promised that he's going to formally write to the minister to request that they reject the select committee's advice. Basically, for anybody that isn't following, the select committee scrutinised a bill which looked to ban all wild animals in circuses in England, and when the committee looked at it, they basically said that actually it should be limited to big cats and elephants, which at the time that they brought that report out, there were no big cats and elephants. So in effect, they were recommending that a ban on wild animals in circuses banned absolutely 0 animals. But we're hoping that that advice will be rejected. If the government tries to go down that path, then we've got a number of things up our sleeve, because we believe that it would be illegal for them to go down that path, and there may be an opportunity for judicial review because they haven't consulted on having this very narrow ban. So we think there's options there.
So it's looking quite bright for wild animals to be banned in circuses.
I don't say. We've been saying it for years.
Well, we'll
keep pushing, and it's end of 2015. We've got a lot of time to play with if they try and go back on it again. But yeah.
In the meantime, will CAPS campaign against all animals in circuses?
Of course.
In the meantime, or wait until the ban on wild comes in before they campaign?
We've always campaigned on the use of domesticated animals in circuses. I think realistically, it's not a policy issue for our government at the minute, and it won't be. So that campaign is much more on the streets. It's much more getting people to demos and kind of hitting the circuses where it hurts them in the pocket.
We'll keep doing that.
I know you can do that, and we've seen circuses drop domesticated animal acts in the last few years just because of grassroots activism, and I think for now that's the way to go, because we're not going to see a legislative ban on domesticated animals in circuses anytime soon.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay.
Hello, I'm not sure if I understood something in the correct way. I think you said that the ban of pinioning is a prohibitive reform, because I think it's just a sequence of the usage of birds in zoos, and it doesn't lead to the ban of big birds in zoos. So it's just a regulative reform that bans this concrete practice.
Mm-hmm. I think, and I guess this is the debate from yesterday, isn't it? I suppose from our point of view, it's prohibitive in a factual sense, in the fact it would prohibit this particular practice. But obviously, by prohibiting the practice, we're not then removing the birds from zoos. We're just banning this practice, like you say. I think it can be a prohibitive reform on the basis that, like the use of cetaceans in zoos, by stopping zoos pinioning, they just don't want to pay. They don't want to pay the money. It's as simple as that, to net these huge sort of water areas for the birds. So the likelihood is, and the industry have said this, that they will sort of be forced to stop. There will be zoos that will be able to afford to build these huge enclosures. Places like London Zoo, Chester Zoo, but the smaller places, and that can run to thousands of birds. I think they will be stopped by virtue of that. So arguably, it could be considered a prohibitive reform, but I'm not going to argue the toss on it.
More questions? Yeah. Who was it?
Hey Liz, thanks.
Hi.
What about the role of sanctuaries? Have they sprung up as a need, kind of to take some of these animals in?
Yeah, I think so, and that's. I think we were talking yesterday, weren't we, about the idea of sort of sanctuaries and pseudo-sanctuaries, and it's a big problem, probably not so much from our point of view as campaigners, but from a public perception point of view, that any zoo can call itself a rescue centre or a sanctuary. From our point of view, obviously there's fundamental differences, the idea of offering a home for life, no breeding, and simply that the animals come first. And unfortunately, they're few and far between. But there's starting to be sort of an upsurge there's now accreditation of sanctuaries for the first time. So these sort of charlatan-type operations. There's the Global Federation of Accredited Sanctuaries, which is now operating in Europe and in the United States, and I think you guys are having meetings with them soon. And that's basically the sort of a standard of accreditation which recognises that somewhere is a sanctuary as opposed to a zoo pretending to be a sanctuary. From our point of view, then sanctuaries are not just welcome, they're absolutely necessary, because what else is going to happen to the hundreds of thousands of animals? Again, it's a very, very slow process. We're under no illusion that the zoo gates are going to shut and then all these animals are going to be shifted to these sanctuaries. But I think we've got to start working towards that sort of end.
I'd like to pick you up on what you said in the beginning about the difference of using existing laws or changing the laws.
Yeah. And what
from your presentation, I see that you are outlining a strategy of using existing laws to further the cause of abolitionism. And you are saying that even if the laws are very crappy, we can still use them for the cause of abolitionism, as long as the message is very clear. But then, why can't we make the same point about changing the laws? Because why can't we say that some reforms in the laws, even if they are not what we want in the end, they can further the cause of abolitionism, because then you can use those laws against the industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think absolutely, you know, that we work towards both. So, for example, the circus ban's a great example whereby we've been working very hard towards seeing a ban. We'd like to see a ban on all animals and circuses, but if we can get that legislation through that says a ban on wild animals, then that's a step towards abolition. And we work very strongly on that. I think there are certain industries which circuses are perhaps one of the exceptions where, from a public perception and also from a sort of public policy perception, people reject them on a much wider sense. Whereas when you're looking at industries such as vivisection or zoos, much as I would love to think there could be new legislation which would ban or prohibit or even certain parts of zoos, certain species. I don't think we're at a point where that's going to happen yet pragmatically. So I think we will continue to work for prohibitive action wherever and whenever we can, whenever we feel that it's a realistic option. And I think in the meantime, when we're dealing with industries that are so huge that we can chip away at them, then I think that's another avenue that we'll explore. Does that answer your question more or less? Okay.
Good morning, Liz.
Hi.
Just a couple of questions. When you were saying about judicial review failing in England for badger, what do you do at that point?
What all the incredible campaigners and activists are doing at the minute, I think absolutely everything they possibly can. I think obviously, you know, it's using the law as a campaigning tool. It's just one tool, but there are so many others. And we haven't been involved in the badger cull process, but it's astounding. I've never seen such a mobilisation of people. So I don't know what else people can do than they're already doing, really. And
would you agree with Gandhi's statement when he says if the law is wrong, the right thing to do is break it?
I think there's I mean, I think not necessarily in all circumstances, but I think as long as it's non-violent, and I think as, you know, clear aims and sort of moving towards, so, you know, civil disobedience and things like that, then what can I say? It's not necessarily something that I would do personally, but it's obviously something which achieves goals, and if it does that, then who am I to judge anybody else?
More questions? Yeah.
Hi, Liz.
Hiya.
It's about challenging the legality of force-fed ducks and geese in Europe. The group that I'm involved in, we've been challenging one of the directors with the directive, I think it's 54, with the World Farming, and basically it says that no animal should be fed in a way to cause it distress, and that's a directive at European level. And we've been challenging this at European. We've got a lot of MPs on board with this, but it's how do you enforce a law that's there and they're still force-feeding ducks and geese? Is there somebody that we can...
In the UK?
This is Europe. In Europe, there's a law that says that no animal should be fed in a way that causes distress.
And then that's transposed into national law?
Yes, but we're trying to challenge, basically, we're trying to challenge the legality of importation of foie gras into Europe, where the production's being banned, but also foie gras in general, because there's a European directive to say that they can't really force feed these animals. So we've been in touch with various different people at European level. How is there someone you can recommend that we can try and...
There probably
fight
is. Maybe
this law?
if we can, if we can sit down afterwards, and I can sit there. There's a couple of people that spring to mind, but it would depend exactly what area of law and where it's sort of.
Yeah. So basically, there's a law, but it's not being. It's not being, obeyed.
Yeah, we'll have a chat afterwards, and we'll see if I can recommend anyone.
Yeah. Thanks.
There's a couple of people that spring to mind.
Cheers.
Thank you. Somebody else?
Am I done?
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
How unlikely is it that the law will adapt to the industry if you find an illegal behavior?
This is obviously one of the problems, and this is one of our, for example, with our pinioning campaign, and this is one of the issues we've got. If we can get government to open a consultation, then it could well be that it's simply decided that, it's fine for non-vets to do it, and actually we don't make the situation worse, but we then entrench the situation as it was already. We look at that really carefully before we start anything, and I think we look at what the industry is likely to do, and on that particular campaign for us, we decided it was unlikely, and this is what we've seen, that the industry don't even want to admit they're doing it. So the likelihood of them lobbying hard to keep it, they've seen the publicity that they've got already, then we're quite confident that actually it would be a very sort of they're not going to come forward now and suddenly start being very public about something they've denied for so long. So it's a gamble. It's always a gamble. I guess our sort of position is that it's happening anyway at the minute. There were tens of thousands of birds having their wings hacked off by lay people, and if it stops some zoos doing it, great. And then when it gets to the consultation stage, then it's our responsibility to make sure we mobilise enough people to get that through and make the changes we want, but nothing's ever set in stone, unfortunately.
No more questions? Okay, then thank you.
Thank you.